But the fun part of being in Toronto is almost all of the birds you're going to see throughout the province at least pass through Toronto in migration. So there's not a day when you can go out, especially from now until the end of May, where you can't see new birds passing through Ontario. So it's just a wonderful place.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You may have noticed that author Keo McClear, who was originally scheduled to be with us tonight, unfortunately could not make it. She's unfortunately had a bit of an injury, so we wish her very well. And I'm sorry, you're getting the communications manager, as she mentioned, of the ROM right over here. But that means I have worked with these lovely people quite a bit, and we're really looking forward to telling you all about this magnificent field guide. I hope some of you have it, and if you don't, afterwards you can buy copies and get them signed. And, you know, I think, actually, before I even say that, Keo McClear has a lovely book called Birds, Art, Life. I don't know, many of you may have already known about it. It's a memoir, so we highly recommend that. And again, sending her best wishes for getting well. That also said, Keo has shared a few of the questions that she wanted to ask Mark and Emily because they had touched base beforehand. So we will kind of wrap some of those into our discussion today. And you are in for a real treat because these two wonderful experts are going to walk us through this beautiful book and also about the wonder of birds all around us. And as Elspeth mentioned, I'm part of the communications team at the ROM, many of whom are with us tonight, so thank you to them. And we also have a publishing arm at the museum that you might not know about. So that's the arm that publishes books like these. And I have to acknowledge some of the people who actually helped bring this book to life, including our publishing director, Shiza Sarfraz, senior graphic designer Tara Winterholt, and communications coordinator Monica Tragars, who are all also here tonight, so cheers to them. And the Field Guide to Birds of Ontario is just actually one of the many best-selling titles of field guides that ROM puts out. And this one in particular features 350 species of breeding birds that call Ontario home. And there's actually a rich tradition of field guides. Many of you may have grown up with them. They go back hundreds of years, so ROM is continuing in that tradition by offering these handy books that are not just a resource, but also a beautifully designed object in its own right. And the guide actually is very timely. Some of you might know the rising popularity of birding in North America. It means that this is going to be a handy resource for a lot of people, especially with Ontario proving a really popular destination for birding. And we're actually just getting into that season now with spring upon us. So some of you may be getting ready to go out on birding adventures yourselves. So Mark and Emily are going to tell us a little bit about the book and just how it all came together. So welcome to you both. And thanks so much for being here today.
Happy to.
And also for this guide, really, that gives us such a delving right into the world of birds, whether we're totally new to birding or some people might be old hat at it by now. And I'm guessing we probably have a mix of both tonight. So I guess the way I wanted to get started is just thinking about going back to the very beginning. So what was it about birds that kind of first intrigued you, and what inspired you to get into birding? Emily, shall we start with you?
Yeah, we can start with me. So I came to birding, I wouldn't say late, but like in my 20s. And I didn't come to it as like part of a family tradition or anything like that. I'm from Toronto, raised by like immigrant parents who aren't really into the nature scene. But I got into it through academia. And I was always interested in wildlife and zoology. And I started to do my master's on birds. And as part of my research, I had to interview a bunch of bird watchers. And I needed to get their records. And I was studying how their records kind of mirrored, our understanding of bird trends over time. And as I talked to more and more bird watchers, I just became a bird watcher myself. It just slowly kind of seeped into me. And I started to really appreciate the way that they saw the world, and I started to notice birds. So in addition to it being like my study, it just started being my hobby too. And then work and hobbies just kind of merged and melded, and it was really hard to tell where one ended and one began.
The best kind of thing when that happens, right?
Best or worst, yeah, exactly.
And Mark?
Yeah, I think in my case, nepotism is a huge part of my entire life. I was born into a family that had a father who was very interested in birds. He was a veterinarian by profession, but family vacations were actually planned around birding trips. And there were 4 children in the family, and I was sort of the second oldest, and my eldest sister, Leslie, didn't want anything to do with it. I was sort of tasked with keeping Dad happy, and as a result, I became sort of the birder in the family. And my father also worked as a volunteer at the Royal Ontario Museum, so I had an into the museum. I took advantage of that, and I started out as a camp cook for field camps up in Northern Ontario for birding trips, and then finally got a job at the museum, and I stayed there. It was a 5-year plan. I was just gonna, get some experience, and I stayed for 41 years. So yeah, I went the exact opposite direction. Yeah.
Wonderful. And, you sort of touched on this, but did perhaps more you, Mark, that you grew up in families that kind of touched on field guides at all? Or, can you think of when you first encountered them?
Yeah, well, for me, yes, very clearly. Like, I was just getting into birding, and I picked up a used field guide, the Peterson guide, at a used bookstore. It was around $2. It looked a lot like this. Mark brought his oldest guide, the Golden Guide, that we still have. And I remember being like, okay, I'm going to use this and identify a bird. And most birds were fast, and it was hard, but I finally found one that stayed still. And I looked through every single plate and I just flipped through the guide. And it was a common grackle, which if you've seen an old field guide is like near the very back of most field guides. So I flipped through the entire book, and on the last plate page, I found my bird. And I've like never come down from that high since. And now, and I needed to do it more and more and more. But it was like a great experience actually flipping through the whole thing. I think, and that's what I think we want people to do with this guide is, you can use it to find your bird, but it's a great experience to just become familiar through flipping through it with, what's out there.
Yeah, in my case, I did my first birding trip, family vacation, at the age of 3. I think we went out east, and every year it was someplace different. And it wasn't just, local. We were going to Texas, or we were going to Florida, or we were going to Northern Ontario. And what we always did was we always had a station wagon. Dad would throw all the kids in the back of the station wagon. And to pass the time, because we didn't have apps or phones or anything, we had the Golden Guide, bird guide. So my brother and I would quiz each other along the road for hours at a time. And we became, we could tell you what page birds were on by the time this was all finished. So it was a wonderful introduction to me, and the field guide was a huge part of it.
Well, speaking of pages, we of course have a book crowd here, naturally. So let's talk a little bit about how the book came together. I mean, obviously one of the first things readers will notice is that the beautiful photographs in this book is an illustrated guide. So, and just so you all know, there's 600 different images in total. So what kind of goes into putting together a guide like this? So Emily, like when you were first starting to think about this and work with the ROM on it, who was the audience that you had in mind for the book?
So Mark and I talked about this a lot. We were really intentional that we wanted every kind of, there's first of all a lot of ways to be a birder, and birding is a very long journey that can take like decades or your whole life. We wanted somebody in any stage of that journey to be able to use the guide for something. So we wanted to put in information that even a seasoned birder would find interesting, like details about breeding biology, for instance. But we also really hoped and tried to make it accessible for people who are just starting out. So if you don't know what you're looking at yet, it can help you. So that was something we tried to find the balance of, because field guides are for everybody, and they can be used for a lot of different things.
Yeah, and field guides can be very complicated. If you've ever looked at the National Geographic Field Guide or the Sibley Field Guide, there's almost 800 species of birds in and around North America. And that's a lot when you're starting out. So we wanted to be very focused in Ontario. We wanted to focus, Ontario's got 511 documented species that have been seen in the province. Chances are you're not going to see 150 of them because they're accidental birds or birds that, show up once or twice in 20 years. So we wanted to focus very much on the birds you are likely to see. And then we wanted to be able to present those in both images. And birdie's not simply one male will cover it off. So you've got males and females in different plumages. You've got spring and fall plumages. And we wanted to try and cover that off as much as possible. The challenge is, we had a wonderful editor and designer who said, you can't do everything you want to do. And so we worked with them, and they were tremendous help in Shiza and Tara. Said, no, this isn't going to work. If you want to put 300 or 3 pictures in, you've got to cut back on the writing. And so it's a lot more difficult than I realized it was going to be.
Yeah, I thought of it as early on, like for some of the charismatic birds that we love and we didn't know what the layout would look like yet, so we just wrote a whole thing about seeing a long-tailed duck. That's a Toronto specialty. That's an incredible bird. You can hear them. It's just such an experience, and it's this annual rite of passage. I think we wrote basically 2 pages of poetry about long-tailed ducks, and then Tara's you're gonna need to cut 85% of this. And I think it's like writing a haiku. You have a very strict structure, but you have freedom within it, and it became an exercise in what's really important to convey what we want to convey. And it turns out you don't always need more words, but yeah, it was good. We needed discipline.
You're talking to a writer. I know what you're talking about. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure and sort of layout of this book. So Mark, obviously, Emily's just touched on this. It was a collaborative process, obviously, with the ROM team. Yeah. But how did you sort of work your way through that and decide what would be the best sort of way to, especially you're talking about your audience and wanting it to be broad. So how do you manage to then tackle that in the format of this particular type of book?
Yeah, we wanted to make it as accessible as possible. We wanted to have, because the community is growing so much and it's such a wonderful community that we wanted to be able to reach everyone. And there's so many different places where you can get information on birds today. So we wanted to keep this a book that you could have on your kitchen counter if you were looking out, your window, and you had a bird feeder set up, or up at the cottage, or just anywhere, somewhere accessible. So that was always in the back of our mind. And then we wanted to get as many images in as possible so that when people saw the A species, they were able to identify it. And not just the males, but males and females and young birds as well. And
also how they look in Ontario. Because we touch on this, we give a workshop on this book. Sometimes you'll see in a North America wide field guide a picture of a species as it looks in perfect adult breeding plumage. But when that bird shows up in Ontario, we tend not to see it like that. I'm thinking about a king eider or a purple gallinule. We get lost teenagers in Ontario a lot. We don't get the full adult. We showed you the lost teenager in the book because this is an Ontario guide. We wanted to show you what you're likely to see and speak to your birding experience. One other thing I will say is we wanted it to be help identify, but a couple of things, we snuck in some breeding biology in there. Part of it's that's Mark's main specialty. He's a nest and egg specialist, and it's something that he really loves, and it's something not even birders who are really seasoned in listing and identifying birds don't know a lot about. So we snuck in stuff that we just liked like that about birds.
Yeah, and we're hoping to inspire people to not just identify the bird, but maybe spend a little more time looking at its behavior and trying to understand what it's trying to do. And so, breeding biology is incredibly important for the conservation of the species. So a little bit of information there, and we can talk about citizen science programs after. But we thought it was a good idea to take it to that next step for people.
I want to pick up on 2 threads there. So one, obviously, it's a field guide to birds of Ontario. So why Ontario? Why did you decide we really want to focus on the homegrown, the things you can kind of see in our own province?
Well, to be honest, the ROM is a provincial museum, and they put out guides to the species of Ontario. So that was it. But, even if we didn't have to, it's a really good framing for bird biology because it's a manageable amount of species. And I think most people bird in their province. And I know that as an Ontario-based birder myself, when I did start birding, like you got a lot of guides like this, birds, of North America, and you're bogged down with a lot of birds that you're not going to see. So this helps narrow it down for you, and it's like bite-sized. It's more digestible.
I love that. And Mark, you mentioned a couple of times now the male of the species. Why is that important in birding?
Well, because there's been too much emphasis placed on male birds over the years. Everyone, the names of a lot of birds. If you ever think about a red-winged blackbird, red-winged blackbird males have red wings, females don't. They're brown and streaked. And so I think we wanted to be able to show off the female side of things a little bit more, and that was fun. And I think for Ontario, I love Ontario, and I love birding in Ontario. Ontario, even though we're in sort of the southern part of it, it's a huge province with wonderful diversity of habitat. How many of you have ever been up to sort of Cochrane's or Timmins area?
Well, a few, more than.
All right, good. More of you need to go up there, and go up midwinter, and take a road called the Detour Mine Road.
Mark, you lost them.
And you can almost get up to Moosonee. And you may not know this, but we actually have an ocean in Ontario. You just have to go really far north to get to it.
But yeah, I mean, we love the birds of the province. I do think that the amazing, like Mark just said, the amazing natural diversity of Ontario is underappreciated. Mostly just because the road system in Ontario is so concentrated in the south, but yeah, it's a beautiful place.
We're going to get to some of your favorites and all of that coming up, but before we leave the book, what was, you would say, kind of the most rewarding part of the process, but then also maybe the most frustrating? You've touched a little bit on that already.
Yeah, the most rewarding part of the process was having the opportunity to go through it's felt indulgent, every single species, and think about it and write about it and talk about it. As somebody who loves birds, that was a fun exercise. The most frustrating part was, we had two authors. Sometimes we divvied birds up by families we like. For instance, Mark's a real expert on shorebirds. I'm more of an expert on songbirds, and we divvied it up. There were certain groups neither of us wanted to do, and we had to kind of figure it out. There were certain ones that we kind of fought over because we both liked them equally. So yeah, the art of compromise was something that we had to perfect.
Yeah, and I think we both have sort of our areas of expertise. I do a lot of the photography in the book, and I've always loved the photographic aspect of birds. Whereas Emily was much better at the editing of the book and keeping me in line with what we were supposed to be doing, because I tend to go off on tangents like I'm probably doing right now. But yeah, it was a fun experience, and we really, I'm going to go back to Shiza and Tara again. They were just such a great help and so supportive that it was really a fun exercise.
Oh, I thought of something I wanted to say about that too, actually. One thing that was frustrating was the bird taxonomy.
Oh, yeah.
I really want to talk. So I don't know if you guys know what I mean by that. The way birds are organized in the book is according to how closely birds are related, according to the family tree of birds, which is great. And that makes sense from a scientific point of view. More closely related birds are together, etc. So I was responsible for the organization of the taxonomy in the book, which changed continuously throughout the writing process because they're just researching bird taxonomy right now in a really big way in academia. So I had to rearrange the order of birds constantly as we were writing, and I can see she's just looking at me because a few days before we wanted to go send the book to the printers, I was like, stop everything, we need to arrange 12 species, they're not in the right order anymore. So that was a frustration, but it's also due to us as a scientific community learning more about birds. So this will be up to date until they publish another study, which is really good.
Yeah, if you ever look at a book from 20 years ago, and ROM actually published a Birds of Ontario Field Guide about 20 years ago, the taxonomy or the relationships or where you're going to find birds on what page has completely changed. Yeah. So we're all starting fresh. So if you're just starting to bird now, you're at the same level as I am trying to find a bird in that book.
In our book that we wrote, honestly.
Yeah, so, it used to be that common loon was the first bird that you'd see in your book. Today, it's now the snow goose. And common loon's halfway through the sort of
Oh
the
yeah,
book.
and like sparrows, house sparrows not at the end anymore. Now it's blackbirds. Yeah. So often, like when we give workshops on the book, people are like, "Oh yeah, where's kingfisher?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I forget. Like I need to look." So yeah, we're all in it together. It's nice.
Exactly.
And I mean, speaking of which, of course, we've been focusing on how we're talking about birds right in our own backyard. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about the just rich diversity of bird species in Ontario?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are 500 species. You know, we do have Carolinian forest, we have south mixed woodland, we have Hudson Bay lowlands. But the fun part of being in Toronto is almost all of the birds you're going to see throughout the province at least pass through Toronto in migration. So there's not a day when you can go out, especially from now until the end of May, where you can't see new birds passing through Ontario. So it's just a wonderful place with, not diverse as sort of the
Like
tropical
Peru,
regions and
yeah.
stuff, but in terms of Canada, maybe BC's got more. Anyway, we have some of the most diverse areas in the country.
And Emily, then are there any birds here in the province that are maybe overlooked and kind of deserve more attention? So I'm thinking maybe not like a rare or flashy bird, but ones that kind of just reward sustained attention.
Well, I do think, common birds sometimes are overlooked in general, just because there's one type of birding that people do. There's a lot of ways to be a birder, but one way that some people bird is by looking for rare birds or unusual birds. However, I mean, I've been through many stages in my birding career, my birding journey. That appeals to me less and less. I feel like I'm more interested these days in habitat-based birding. And yeah, our common birds are stunning. They still change throughout the year as migration happens and breeding happens. And so it's always a different cast of characters of common birds, and they're easier to find, and they're always doing interesting things. So yeah, there's hundreds of them. And I would, urge people not to necessarily focus on ticking a box of seeing something rare, but in Toronto itself, if you just kind of looked around and noticed birds more in your day-to-day life, you could easily see hundreds of species a year. So yeah, I would.
Yeah, and you don't have to go on specific birding trips to go birding. As I mentioned, you can look at birds in your backyard, you can go for a walk in your local park, and you start to observe the birds around you, and you'll start to observe nature around you. And there's nothing like it. There's so much out there to sort of understand or try to understand or get a better picture of. And it's just fun. And, we used to do it a lot when we were driving. That's not a great idea if you're the driver. But next time you're driving down the highway or in the passenger seat, you can see red-tailed hawks on the side of the road. You can see kestrels, or you might see a meadowlark on a fence post. It just makes you become a better observer of the world around you. And to me, that's really gratifying and important.
And I think Keo said that, who couldn't be here, who was going to be our author moderator. It is, I remember the time, before birds in my life and after birds, and it is just kind of a daily practice. It's not like you have to go somewhere or do something different. It's just suddenly there's a new layer to your noticing of what's around you, and there's always birds. Birders go on specific trips to garbage dumps and sewage lagoons, guys. They're in every environment that you've ever been, there have been wild species to look at. It's incredible. So it's just an extra layer to your daily life.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. And Mark, you kind of touched on this earlier, but can you explain what an accidental bird is? And maybe can you tell us a little bit about a personal encounter with one?
Oh, that's a good, okay. So we often, in the birding world, we split birds into sort of common birds, uncommon birds, rare birds, and then accidentals or vagrants. And common birds are like the American robin or the house sparrow that you see on a daily basis. Rare birds are birds that you can, if you really work hard at it, you should be able to see one or two a year, or they should show up in Ontario on a regular or irregular basis. Accidentals are the ones that just don't belong in Ontario. And somewhere along the line, they got lost on migration, or they were windblown in a hurricane, and they end up in the province. And these are the birds that what we call the listers are very excited about. These are the birds that if, a bird like a caracara, which is a hawk-like bird, shows up in Wawa, Ontario,
Which happened. Yeah.
people will drive 15 hours to see that bird, look at it for 5 minutes, check it off their list and say, what a great day. And which is crazy, but birders can be a little obsessive. And
Well,
it can
tell
also
them
be
about
fun.
Montreal. So there was the first ever, I think, record of the year. There was a European robin, not like our robin, very different, that was seen in Montreal. And people from all over Canada went to look at it. That was just, I think it's still there, actually. It's been over...
Yeah, I'm not sure it's still
I'm not
there
sure if
now,
it still
but-
survived, but it was there for months. Mark, you should tell them in terms of a vagrant, because this is also a ROM story. You should tell them about the albatross.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, this is okay, I'll try and keep this short. So one day, a man in Kingston reported seeing an albatross. And everyone said, well, that's crazy. Albatrosses are southern hemisphere only.
They live in the middle of the ocean. Yeah.
Impossible. And everyone just sort of said, blew it off and said, that's not right. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, an albatross was found injured or not in great shape on the shore of the lake near Kingston. It was picked up. It was taken to a rehab center. So first of all, the guy was right. And then the rehab center in Ontario didn't feel like they had enough experience, so it was sent to New Jersey. The New Jersey gang didn't think they had enough experience, so eventually it's made its way down to Florida, still alive, and then slowly succumbed to its injury. And I was down in Florida doing some field work on shorebirds, and someone happened to mention it to me, and I worked at the museum, and they said, yeah, we have a frozen albatross. And I said, oh, I'd like that for the museum. And so very quickly, we arranged permits, and in the back of my cooler, I stuck a frozen albatross and drove it back with my kids, because I did the same thing my dad did to us, from Florida, and it's now in the museum. A yellow-nosed albatross made its way back to Ontario just out of serendipity.
But honestly, I think the moral of the story is you have to treat every bird sighting seriously. Like, don't blow anybody off. Whatever they say they saw, it might happen. And that's something that I feel like the bird community can kind of be dismissive, especially of newcomers. You might have seen a crazy thing. Like, don't be confident in your sightings, because the yellow-nosed albatross story shows you that any bird sighting can happen, regardless of how rare it might be.
However, a photograph would help.
Says the bird photographer. And of course, I think many of you know that birding has become almost ubiquitous, especially since the pandemic, when people were looking for hobbies to get outdoors. And we have a lovely question from Kyo herself, and she wanted to know, do you think birders are born or made? Is there kind of a particular quality of attention that draws certain people to birds?
Yeah, I saw that question and I thought it was so interesting, so I just asked Mark if I could answer. I honestly think everybody's kind of a birder, regardless. I think people are naturally interested in birds, and I'm highly biased, but birds feature so heavily in art and music and culture. Everybody around the world appreciates birds in different ways so much. Now, not everybody's had the opportunity to go out and see different wild species or maybe be able to identify them yet, although there's a great book for that, I hear. But I've led a lot of birding tours. I think that everybody has a latent, I think it's just very human to have an interest in birds because of how beautiful they are and, the amazing things they do and the singing that they do. It's inspired people forever, as long as there have been people. So I think birders are born, and I think we're all kind of birders. That's my answer to that.
Yeah, I think we could probably put a test together in this room, and all of you would get, if we put 20
Common birds.
images, common birds on the screen, all of you would get them right. All of you know what an owl looks like. Everyone knows what a robin, the
Or
American
Canada
robin
goose,
looks like,
or
Canada
crow.
goose. Yeah, and it's easy, and you did it as kids. And and I don't even know how kids learn some of these birds, but they do. And I'm sure you've retained at least 20 species already.
Yeah, we just naturally know about them in a lot of ways. Like they're just part of our cultural backdrop, regardless of what culture you're in, I think.
I hadn't even thought of that. I really love that idea. And of course, we can't discuss birds and birding without touching on the ethics of birding and environmental impacts. And you have a whole section in the book about ethics that emphasizes the importance of protecting habitat and placing the welfare of birds first. So, Emily, when you worked at Birds Canada, there was a specific code of conduct that essentially stated that, right?
Well, yeah, kind of. Like, I know people are always like, well, how can you... it's a big topic. As more and more people are interested in birds, birding ethically becomes more important, right? And yeah, when I worked at Birds Canada, I remember I was part of the bird banding operation, which is when you catch birds in mist nets and you put little bands on their legs and then you let them go. And it's very exciting for the people doing the banding. They get to hold birds, they want to take pictures with them, we hand them off, people want to observe them. But there was a sign that was above the banding chair that Stu McKenzie, who I think still runs the station, said, and it said, "Birds first." Just as a reminder to whoever was in there that regardless of how excited you are to pull a rare bird out of the bag and you want to take 8 pictures and you want to take these measurements and you want to do, the welfare of the bird comes first. So that's something that's always really important, a birds first rather than but I want the picture or I want a sighting. Like, I think that's important. And then just for birding in general, I think what I would add on that is birds first, other people second. Like, we live in a society and we shouldn't damage habitat for others or be disrespectful of one another or whatever, trespass. And then maybe ourselves third. And I think as long as you keep that in mind, you're probably pretty guaranteed to act well and respectfully of both, birds and everybody else.
Yeah, and especially in Toronto or highly populated areas, we have limited amount of green space. And so what I would ask, especially, in these heavily populated areas, think about other people. Stay on the trails, because it's not just birds you're looking at. Some people might be interested in insects. Some people might be interested in plants. Just give a little respect for everybody and stay on the trails.
Yeah. And it's good for everybody. I mean, we can disturb birds so easily. Mark, who's always interested in nests and eggs, like, I found a lot of fun nests with him. Half of the birds of Toronto nest on the ground. Like, it's important to not bother them, Yeah. So, especially at this time of year.
And we talked a little bit about that culture of the list kind of thing and just trying to check off birds that you can see. But lists are also really important in conservation. I'm just thinking of like the Great Backyard Bird Counts or other lists like that. So how do you kind of see the tension between that sort of Pokemon-style catch-em-all type of list versus something more deliberate like a conservation checklist?
They can be both together. There's a number of apps. How many of you are familiar with eBird? Have you ever heard of eBird? So eBird is this wonderful citizen or community science program that keeps track of your lists. So if you go out for a day of birding and you see 15 species and you put that into eBird, which is available on your computer or on your phone, it immediately, you have to register and it's all free. It keeps track of those lists. But at the same time, it's collecting everyone's list around the world and building this enormous biological database, which has been incredible for learning about what birds are doing and what conservation initiatives are necessary for these birds. It's really been this secret and wonderful way of going birding. So it takes in a lot of information, but it gives so much information back to the volunteer. And, it'll send you daily emails of rare birds that are being seen in and around the area if you want to see them. So it's just this wonderful program. If you've never tried it, investigate it first, but then join up and keep track of your birds.
And it's part of this long tradition. I will say this, one of the things I loved about working in ornithology with birds is that the history of bird research, ornithology, not just in Ontario, but everywhere, is one where the line between amateur and professional, hobbyists and biologists, it's always been really blurry. And amateurs, that's not even the right word, hobbyists, people who don't get paid for what they're doing, are the backbone of what we just know about birds in the world. Most of the bird data, science, research has been done by people not because they were paid to do a job, but because they love birds and wrote down what they saw. That forms the basis of our knowledge on this thing. And so things like eBird are just a continuation of that. Mark talked a lot about his dad, who was a bird enthusiast, a birder. He was not paid to bird, but he ran the Ontario Bird Record Scheme. Most of what we know about breeding birds in the province is because he had a hobby. And so, I mean, and now things like eBird make it even easier. So yeah, your bird sightings matter a lot. It's fun for you, but it's also really important.
Yeah, everyone can contribute to bird conservation.
And speaking of contribute, we're going to get to your audience questions just in a second, but we're just going to wrap up by thinking about the purpose of this beautiful but very useful book. So, in some ways, a field guide sounds like almost old-fashioned in this day and age, right? With all this digital tech. Mark, you talked about some of the apps. So how did you kind of navigate the challenge of writing a book in the digital era?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, so Mark and I were talking about that. Part of it's the Ontario focus, but we were talking about it. We don't see them as in tension to one another because we use pretty much every single app that exists. We also have pretty much every bird book that exists. Like most people who are into birds do both, and they each fulfill a slightly different role for you. Books are wonderful to just flip through. With apps, often you kind of need to know what you're doing or have a predefined purpose. Books are amazing to just kind of, it's more passive in a way and more exploratory. I don't know. I think that they really do complement one another. A book like ours, I also feel like, is really flexible because the first bird books were not meant to be taken in the field. A field guide, you have the option of like just flipping through it at home, thinking about birds, reading about a few species at a time, or taking it with you in the field and using it as you look at birds. So you can use it any way you want. I like the flexibility of it.
Yeah, and I don't see anything wrong with books. Are they old-fashioned? I don't think they're old-fashioned.
I think you're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, that's right. You've all drunk the Kool-Aid, right? Yeah, they're amazing, and they're great to have. And, I had a book collection. My father had a book collection. National Geographic Birds of North America has put out 9 editions of their book. And we still have every single one. The same, it's changing all the time, and there's new material to learn. And it's a little easier to access sometimes than your phone. Not that there's anything wrong with your phone, but yeah, I like to have the hard copy in the hand sometimes.
You can get a feel for how many birds there are. Like you can feel the heft of it, and if there's a bird per page. You can I don't know. There's just the tactile part of it gives you some information too about what's in there. So. Yeah.
Wonderful. And just lastly, we've touched on how you want this to be sort of a book for everyone, but what do you want kind of readers or people who are using it out in the field to take away from the field guide? Honestly,
there's so many different things. We just hope that people find what they like. We hope some people like the photographs, and if you're visual, that's okay. I worked very hard on describing bird sounds, so I hope some of you like that. I don't think that there's a single thing. We just hope that we provided enough options of types of information in the book that people can use it in whatever way feels right for them.
Yeah, I think, just to get more people outside and going for walks in green spaces around Toronto or around the province.
Or social good.
And just start to look around rather than, what's on my phone. And that to me would be a wonderful way. And there's nothing wrong with your phone. I don't know if I'm skipping. I don't think I'm skipping ahead, but how many of you have heard of the Merlin app?
Oh, yeah, look at that.
Look at that.
Isn't it a great gateway drug into birding? Yeah. To me, that is magical. And if you haven't tried it, download the Merlin app. And
we don't work for Merlin. It's a real.
Yeah.
They're saying after you go and get the book,
right.
Obviously.
Hit the audio button, and the Merlin app will help identify birds that are singing around you. And you can do it if you're out for a coffee, sitting in your backyard. It's just so inspiring. And it'll even tell you when the birds are singing so you can start to recognize different bird songs and relate them to the species. And to me, once you do that a few times, you'll think, God, there's a lot of stuff out here. And it's fun. And, it is sort of a treasure hunt at times. And who doesn't love a treasure hunt?
Didn't I tell you you're in for a treat? Thank you, Mark, Emily.